Well, thanks for the gracious introduction, Rich. And it's great to see so many people I know. I know way more than half, and it's part of why I love the Swedenborgian Church. I was just explaining to somebody who doesn't know much about the Swedenborgian Church why I stayed with such a small church, having grown up liberal mainline. And I said, it's really the people and the ideas. It's just a great place to have the best conversations, and hopefully we'll do okay today. So I have a little bit of a playful talk called spiritual physics. Um, and here we go. The late great Ian Barfour did more to construct the science and religion discussion in academia than anybody else. He famously identified four camps in which we find in that conversation. And those four camps are conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. Conflict advocates claim each field denies the other's basis for establishing what's really real in the most fundamental sense. They're in conflict with each other. The independence advocates claim that the two fields are entirely unconnected. They're unconnected realms of inquiry, and you can't really explore them together. They're incapable of being mixed. The dialogue advocates acknowledge each field as a legitimate space of exploration, but claim we still know so little about both fields that the appropriate way for us to be moving forward is simply to be in conversation, to have dialogue. And lastly and finally, the integration advocates claim the overlaps are profound, and they seek a synthesis of science and spirituality and stake out potential models for harmonizing them. Swedenborg is an integrator, and he's in an enviable position for the task when we consider the rarity in history of a thinker who made historic contributions to both categories, not simply being conversant in both categories, but in history books for both categories. Historian of science Pavel Marla Filagi selects Swedenborg on a short list of natural science pathfinders whose ideas proved to be of lasting value into the present tense. The Nobel laureate savant Arrhenius details Swedenborg's importance in the history of astronomy. Princeton science historian Charles Gross persuasively presents Swedenborg as the very first to correctly frame brain location theory, and thus is huge in cognitive science history. And in mechanical science, Swedenborg gets credit for the first realistic design of an aeroplane, the model for which hangs in the Smithsonian there in DC. And Swedenborg's contributions on the other question, the contributions to religion and spirituality, is not in any doubt, as he's a prominent figure of study in the history of religions and benefits from a worldwide church movement devoted to his presentation of Christianity. There are very few names on that list of figures who were not merely active in both conversations, but made historic contributions. And frankly, of the 6 or 7 that I think could get a conversation going around them, Swedenborg is the most fulsome across the divide. Okay, enough commercializing and grandstanding for my favorite thinker. A quick word about Swedenborg's science context, though. And he was in the generation, immediate generation younger than Isaac Newton. He thoroughly read and sometimes criticized Newton, and he tried to meet Newton in person at Cambridge University, but apparently Newton was out of town. Newton has his famous Principia, often pegged as the most influential science book in Western history, where he lays out the physics of 3 great laws of motion that led to his universal law of gravity. When Swedenborg wrote his own Principia 4 years after Newton's death in 1731, Swedenborg extends Newton's theory of gravitation by framing the historic nebular hypothesis theory that debunks the misunderstanding that our solar system is a bunch of happenstance bodies in this heavenly family somehow just hanging out together, by correctly theorizing that every one of those planets began as a chunk of the sun. They're a chunk of solar mass that got flung off the sun, but whose escape was arrested by gravity, the same force that continues to hold them today in their long-lasting cosmic dance. Swedenborg the Integrator is much better known for his spiritual works, and he has a tremendous amount of metaphysics in the way he frames the reality of the levels of spiritual being that are existing in the integrative space in which we live daily. And so, in a playful sense, I'm going to construct Swedenborg's 3 laws of spiritual physics. The first is that there's a spiritual gravity that is acting upon our souls unceasingly. This happens inside of us through the forces of attraction, what we're attracted to, what we're drawn to. The center of our being constantly withstands a multitude of spiritual gravitational forces in the form of desires that pull upon our motivations, pull upon our minds towards the tantalizing apparent rewards of our desires and whatever it is that's capturing our energy system. In a theosophy as old as time, Swedenborg sees the human soul as a place of collision of values that are mutually and that are actually necessary for a growth process. Or put more directly, he believes possible ends need to be experienced in order to be assessed. They need to be known before they can be either bought into or rejected. And so we are designed as a spiritual laboratory for good and evil. The amount of these unseen forces would blow our minds if we could actually see quantified on a graph what we are experiencing throughout our whole lives. We are just so used to feeling that this is just how life is. And Swedenborg says, yes, it is indeed life, life whose very essence is shaped through the forces of spiritual gravity, because it's in this gymnasium of weights where we do our ultimate spiritual choice making, our soul making. There's good spiritual gravity and there's bad spiritual gravity, upward spiritual force and downward spiritual pull. We build muscle or lose muscle strength due to how willing we are to stay engaged in the gym. The 10 Commandments are a terrific cheat sheet for positive and negative attractions. Envy, covetousness, killing, getting rid of people, stealing are all broad spiritual temptations. And we all have tasted a little bit around feelings in those directions, sometimes profoundly. And Swedenborgian spiritual physics squarely engages on how to transform the basis of each of those attractions into its flip of higher possibilities towards love and community. So some gym work tasks go very well. Some are very fierce to get a feeling that we're making progress. But the good news is that we can know the integration that comes from discerning good gravity from bad gravity. A handy Swedenborgian maxim for working out in the gym is pray as if it's all my strength is up to God, but work out as if it's all up to me. That's spiritual law number 1, spiritual physics law number 1. Number 2, right perception can increase our spiritual force. Right perception can increase our spiritual force. Swedenborg emphasizes the power of our mind to alter our spiritual reality for the better. A hallowed Swedenborgian maxim is truth leads. We spend a lot of our life being able to see farther than what we can actually materialize in our spiritual life. We always see much better destinations than what we're actually able to pull off in the present tense. This mismatch is by design. Our spiritual sight is our headlight. Swedenborg harped on this because he saw the functional power of transformational vision in giving us power to go there. An illustration of this is when Roger Bannister ran the first officially timed 4-minute mile in 1954, finally breaking this legendary barrier that had been out of reach for runners for so long. And then there was that day on the Oxley Field in Oxford when it was finally broken. What happened, though, right after that race? Suddenly, other runners broke it the next year. And soon there were plenty of runners beating the 4-minute mile. So what happened suddenly? Were runners suddenly more physically fit and capable? No, they weren't breaking any physical barrier. They were breaking an interior belief barrier that they could actually make that destination. They knew it could be achieved, and they went out and achieved it. Swedenborg's emphasis on the power of truth to create its manifestation has been touted by cultural historians as the original positive thinking theory. Warren Feld Evans, often noted as the one who really shaped positive thinking, though he didn't call it that, what became a thoroughly converted Swedenborgian minister. He had been a Methodist minister, and he saw how positive thinking works through Swedenborg's metaphysics of how truth leads and then permeates the whole physical self. And he became quite skillful in opening a sanitarium in Boston after he converted over to Swedenborgianism to help people see the thinking processes behind how they can get better physically when they are ill or having challenges with being well. So for the second law of spiritual physics is that correct perception augments the spiritual force available to us for our spiritual journey. And thirdly and last, practice increases force. Practice increases force and accelerates spiritual growth. Professor David Dunaire, a professor of history of science and ideas at the University of Lund in Sweden, did his own doctoral dissertation on Swedenborg's geometry, which he believes is underappreciated among Swedenborg's scientific accomplishments. Spiral motion occurs in a central way in Swedenborg's geometry. Swedenborg believes the spiral is the ideal geometric form due to its mathematical physics of how it increases force in motion as a geometric traveling path. He contends that spiral motion is elemental throughout the created order and is also applicable to spiritual life and spiritual formation, spiritual growth. In physics, the force in spirals accrues through the golden ratio, which in math is called the Fibonacci sequence, which is a series of numbers where each number is in the sequence. As the sequence keeps going, each new number is the sum of the two previous numbers, such that as the spiral progresses, it's rapidly amassing in power and energy and force. That's exactly the strategic strength of regular practice in our spiritual lives. By regular spiritual practice, every time we do again that act in which we are trying to develop consistency and strength, we get this exponential added force to our journey. In practice, we're getting better and better if we stick at it, if we do it, that we have to keep that sequence going of practice. And Swedenborg believes that there's a spiral motion going on in regeneration, the power of living well and living good. So Swedenborg preaches consistency of practice. He had his practices. He was regular. He was diligent. And I believe the integrator saw how very much we are integrated creatures in the physical cosmos with all of its external physics. Sometimes it might feel like we take a step backwards, but we should never give up our practice and our effort. We should never give up our hope and our belief that it is all moving in the right direction, no matter how it might feel in the present moment. We can trust that the spiritual practice physics of the golden mean. So I like hanging out in the integrator's room myself with dialogue partners such as Swedenborg, who perceive such compelling continuities between the natural and the spiritual worlds. He has his famous language of correspondence, that is this force uniting them, paralleling them, and connecting to the energy system of all that is. Einstein once notably said that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Truth be told, they need each other, and their fusion runs very deep. And that's what I have for y'all today.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. That was a very profoundly deep and thoughtful discussion today. And I'm just coming from I'm coming from a conference just to kick it off before we have others ask questions. And I was one of the questions people were asking about the different ways we look at the truth right now is like, what's the future hold? And I was arguing for an integrated future too. And I think it's a very Swedenborgian way to talk about integrating science and faith and different perspectives as well. So I think I'm an integrator too, and I love that. And I love that we embrace both science and faith. Um, you're, and I love the way they use scientific teachings to reflect our personal growth. The whole idea of spiritual gravity. That on my flight back, I watched this movie someone had recommended me called Interstellar, and the whole it's a great movie. I must have watched it years ago. I'm getting old because I can't remember anything, but it was like I watched the first time. But it was great. I highly recommend it. But it's the whole theory of gravity is the whole thrust of it. There's a spiritual dimension to it, and so I thought that was just an interesting bit. But yeah, we're in the gym of life, and we grow through gravity of being pressure tested, and through the force of that. Um, the one question I had that just dawned on my mind, it might be a little esoteric, but when you were describing the spiritual force, the spiral force of that Swedenborg talks about that helps us grow, and we think about that at the individual level, like we we go up the spiral through our life. Do you also believe that the church epochs or the evolution of the society or the world or cultures is also going through a spiral, that same spiral?
That gets really complicated because with individual spiritual practice, um, which seems so straightforward, and I suspect virtually everybody here has some experience around that we grow. When you get into larger groups, there is such a thing, and I take a congregation first before we get to epics, um, that there are a lot of studies on congregational psychology. And of course, groups that meet regularly do develop an entity unto themselves. And so at that level, I do feel there's potential continuity of analysis where we can, and I think the spiraling metaphor, which is perhaps more than a metaphor, can be done with a community and a group nearly as directly as in an individual life. But I'm even though I kind of in my academic training, I'm considered really interdisciplinary. Though of all and I did a lot of practical disciplines, and I had to do in spirituality studies a lot of theology, a lot of psychology. But I consider myself, starting in my college days, a historian more than anything. And the historian in me is always sort of interested in, patterns of history. And what I see in Swedenborg's epics is that it's a theory of returning to balance when unbalance occurs. And I can see that in history. It doesn't mean we're getting better overall. I obviously a lot of things are better. Knowledge systems, technology. Are human beings better actors than they were 2,000, 4,000 years ago? I don't feel ready to comment on that. But I don't see tremendous evidence that we are morally superior. And the last thing I'll say is, um, I took Cal Turley for psychology and religion for no less than 6 classes. And I'm noticing that Ross Capon is here, and Ross's dad and Cal Turley were really good friends. Cal Cal was very, very useful in seeing the problem with seeing enormous advances of humanity as a cluster is that everybody still today starts off as this baby that has no life experience yet. It hasn't learned the first lesson yet. And babies are born of, yes, it's wonderful to watch them smile and gleeful, but they are very egoic. And to be able to get to live through that growth phase of not living primarily for yourself, that what in Christianity is called the second birth. But that concept of the second birth exists in all the major faith traditions. That's this profound ability to rise above living for one's own gratification needs, seeing that living in community that works well is a much better way to love yourself. The rewards out of that kind of love and community, doing things with each other, is so much better than becoming extremely wealthy in terms of money. You can't possibly enjoy physical wealth on the level that you can with community love. And Cal was pointing out, I just don't see how babies are at an advanced stage in any way. The only way that we could imagine progress would be if cultures could maintain their skill and early education and early formation spaces. And that's kind of a big study to really assess how that's going. Thanks for the question, Rich.
Well, thank you. That's in my nerdy mind. These are the questions I'm asking myself. I don't really have anybody to ask. So thank you for answering that. I hope it wasn't too esoteric. Mateus, you put a question in the chat. I wonder if you would say it out loud, please, if you could, and just introduce yourself. I will just say Mateus is on our board, and I don't think the two of you have ever met, but he's one of our younger board members, a brilliant young man who is at Georgetown University Law School right now, and a lovely member of our congregation. So, Mateus, would you be willing to read your question out loud? So sorry, I'm on the train. He's on the train because his
Well,
part.
yeah,
Oh,
read it out loud,
yeah.
Rich.
Katrina, can you read it out loud?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Amazing presentation, says Mateus. My question is, what particularities do spirituality and science each have that the other does not? And how do you think those work together for integrating the two?
I tend to think of when I talk about science, I'm talking about the physical sciences. I'm talking about the natural world. When I think of who we are as human beings and as spiritual creatures, yes, we have a physical body. A lot of what I was talking about, spiritual physics, is about how the psychological spiritual being who has emotions and feelings and accrued memory experiences that are operative in how we experience the next day or make our choices the next day, not always in a good way either, is not true in physics. And so to me, the nexus is Swedenborg's nexus. How is a spiritual cosmos consistently, technically, um, massively integrated with a physical cosmos? And for Swedenborg, it's because the goal is the spiritual formation of life, the psychology of life. So I think that we bring the soft space of decision making and choice making, whereas the physics world gives us the gymnasium and in which we work out, and we don't get to choose different physics for how we might master physics in a lot of ways, but we don't create the physical world. So I think the integration is really just erasing our understanding of who we are and how we're living day by day in the environmental structures in which we find ourselves. And I think for me, there's a lot of hope in that, because a lot of people I know who get depressed or lose hope um, are are skewed towards looking at the difficulty of the physical world and are underplaying the power of the fact that they have an open moment consistently throughout the day and how to use their experiences to grow in the right way. So there's the sort of fragility of our personal consciousness that I think is the secret sauce space, and that's the only thing that we can truly control fully, well, nearly fully.
I like that. So we don't get to pick we get to enter the gym of life. We don't get to pick the gym, but we do get to decide whether we're going to work out and what weights to use. um, Roxanne?
So I'm interested in, across all religions, there are rituals. I don't know of any religion that does not have particular rituals. And so can you speak to the science of rituals and what that does to us as far as our geometry and entering into that spiral?
Rituals are to be enacted. So it fits with the third law of spiritual practice. Being in rituals is one out of many, 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 many forms of practice. Even coming to church like this today, there's something of a ritual. We know how to come. We know there's an order of service. We're not newbies wondering what's going to happen here. We're psychologically, even if we don't even consciously think about it that much, subconsciously, everyone is already attuned to what the ritual is of showing up and exploring matter. So I think rituals is falls into the spiritual practice space, and it's I wouldn't say I'm hesitate to say 100% that that spiritual practice needs to stay repetitive around a practice, because I think there's value in doing things on a lark, that exploring kind of new things on a lark, it can be itself a kind of practice, as long as we do it with consciousness and feeling states. Because I'm ended up, you know, I'm not that I'm necessarily that good at it, but I ended up studying spiritual practice and spiritual formation a lot academically, and I teach it. And so I've ended up playing around with creating a lot of spiritual practices for myself out of taking leads and cues. And I know you do that to a certain extent, Roxanne. Like we could probably talk about what are spiritual practices with animals. It's easy to imagine things to do with animal companionship or interspecies spirituality. So I think that, but in general, I think the power of transforming through spiritual practice does lie in the Fibonacci sequence. That sticking with a practice adds power to we learn how to climb the rope faster, and we if we really could step back and do a comparison thing, we're much higher on the rope than we were when we started. Even if on a daily basis, it feels like I'm just still here. I'm just still the same person.
Well, I think that rituals are really important because it changes our brain. I mean, it physically will change your brain if you stick with it.
Yeah. And I
Well,
appreciate the commercial, Jim, for church. You need to come to church. It's a very important ritual. Come every Sunday.
I say that at my church, I attend a church in the California, and I say that at my church fairly frequently. Coming to church is a practice. You got to make effort to get there, and
Mm,
even though churches tend to be, you know, hit and miss and kind of uneven in their excellence and all that kind of stuff, there's a zazen to showing up.
mm.
There's a zazen to paying attention when we show up, no matter what the harvest is going to be that day. So I actually do like to say that, Rich, a lot, that going to church is a very it's lasted in history because it's so useful overall. It's useful to have the pattern of one day, going through a familiar ritual. So even if a person doesn't want to do meditation or all kinds of exotic spiritual practices, going to church is good. You can just bank it.
Any other questions or from anybody else? Just raise your hand.
Just going to say one of my favorite authors is Karen Armstrong. And interestingly, in her book, The Case for God, she remarks that Kepler, the great mathematician and astronomer, reminds us that early modern science was rooted in faith. During the 16th and 17th centuries, science, philosophy, and religion were tightly welded together. And of course, we know that Newton was deeply religious. So I think you're in good company with Karen Armstrong in making that point.
Yeah, and of course Newton, his religious writings weren't really discovered until the 20th century. He hid them in the mint. He thought that if people saw what he was, the wild stuff he was into, theologically and spiritually, that it would ruin his reputation as a scientist. And of course, he became the master of the mint, and he had his caverns where he hid all these manuscripts, and he died without ever telling anybody about them. They were discovered later. They were put on auction by Sotheby's, and the great economist, who's the early 20th century, the one with sort of the opposite of monetary policy. Can't remember his name. Bought the whole thing. But the last thing is very important, Malcolm, what you're mentioning with Kepler and a little before Kepler, when I said Swedenborg is studied heavily today in Western esoteric traditions, that covers a period of what's called the early modern, with the advent of science, where alchemy was almost like a magical thing. Working with alchemy becomes chemistry. Astrology and the magic powers of the was all a big deal. There was all spirituality around that. That becomes astronomy. And Swedenborg was very aware of a lot of the conversations that were going on in those centuries, that a lot of the religious traditions of Swedenborgians tended to put the kibosh on being clear about the books that were in his library. and certain manuscripts that were in the archives in Stockholm, that there was this attempt by a lot of Swedenborg's followers to hold the argument that Swedenborg got everything he knew from heaven, and do not see the careful year by year progression for over 15 years, where he was doing a lot of investigation of authors on planet Earth that were in what are called, it was called Hermetic philosophy, that gets into this science and metaphysics speculation that starts in the late medieval period and goes on through. So that's a great point you make that Karen Armstrong probably makes to Kepler being, 16th century, getting a little later in the game. But Swedenborg was very involved in the knowledge of how to think through the natural world as a place where incredible powers exist that connect to the inner human spirit.
Well, thank you, Jim, for answering the questions from folks and for your message. You clearly provoked a great discussion, so we really appreciate it. I'll be thinking about this a lot in the future. There's a lot to chew on, and really appreciate your presence and your words and your wisdom. And thank you for sharing it with us.
Great to be here.